Now it's my greatest honor to introduce our speaker, Ezra Greenspan, in this year's Patrick Henry Writing Fellow at the Starr Center for the Study of the American Experience at Washington College. He comes to the Eastern Shore from his home in Dallas, Texas, where he teaches courses on American literature, history, and life, writing at Southern Methodist University to pursue work on a comprehensive biography of the Bailey Douglas family. His lecture tonight is titled Scenes from Frederick Douglass's People, the Baileys of Talbot County in Slavery and Freedom. Please welcome Ezra Greenspan. Thank you.
Good evening. Can you hear me in the back?
Yes.
Okay. I think we're going to try to dim the lights because a crucial part of this, it's not really a lecture, it's more a presentation, will be your being able to read some of the records that I'm going to be showing you. And this may be a test of your eyesight. You know, if it's the problem is not with my images, it may be with your limited vision. Actually, some of the images are not great. I should have known that this night was going to work out well. As I was coming down Washington Street, next to a church, I saw a sign that said, "Your life," and I quote, "your life is a continuing journey." And I thought to myself, this is the way we biographers think of life. Every biography is a journey. You're going on a trip that, at least mine, take about 10 years. You don't know exactly where you're going, but you have confidence that you're going to get there, wherever there is, at the end. It's a little bit like life, and that's what biography is all about. The biography that I'm working on is a work in progress. I don't know exactly how long it's going to take. I don't know quite where it's going to end, but I certainly expect that it's going to end before I'm going to end. I'm going to get this done. I do know, though, exactly where it began and when it began. It began in June of 2015, when my wife and I drove down to Easton. We stayed overnight at a motel, which I will not recommend, on Route 50, not far from town. And we came into town the next morning, and we were looking for a sign that said Frederick Douglass Trailhead. We were looking for the route of Frederick Douglass. We knew absolutely nothing. We were really at the beginning of a project that we were going to have to figure out as we went along. This had happened before. I wrote a biography 10 years before that took 10 years, same kind of process, but what I learned then, I practiced this time. You learn from your ignorance as well as from your mistakes, apparently. And that was, when you don't know where you are, you go to the public library. We came here, we made a few inquiries, and we were directed to the Maryland room. And there, with a big smile welcoming everyone, was Becky Riddy. The project began with Becky. I'm sorry, I don't see Becky here. But I hope she'll get word of what I'm trying to say by way of thanks. And Becky said, you ought to start by reviewing the index cards left by the pioneering historian of Talbot County and biographer of Frederick Douglass, Dixon Preston. Did anybody here? Some of you must have known Mr. Preston. And so I did. And one lesson that I took from that actually is a lesson that I learned earlier. I've been around long enough to have picked up a few things over the years, and that is that biographers ought to pay due respect to the work of their predecessors. We learn from what they've done, and then of course we strike off in our own direction and do our own thing. By way of analogy, that seems to me to be true of family life also, that each generation learns or ought to learn from its predecessors, from its forebearers. And then the younger people are going to go off in their own direction and do their own thing. For me, as a family biographer, these are two affiliated kinds of endeavors. And that, to me, is the presupposition of this project, that writing biography and studying family are completely interrelated kinds of endeavors. And I hope, as I talk tonight, you'll begin to understand more fully what it is I'm talking about. So, thanks first to Becky for helping me to start the project, for helping to organize tonight's talk, and I hope that Becky will be on the ride, on the journey all the way to the end. Thanks to Scotty for helping to set this up, to Dana, and really to the entire staff of the library. I must say, to me, one of the central institutions of the United States, it has been for 150 years, is the public library. And at a time when there seems to be decreasing respect for institutions in this country, to me, the public library, the community library, is simply, as it's always been, but maybe even more so today than in the past, a bastion of what to me community is all about. So to be here tonight, not just in Bailey country, but in the public library associated with the Baileys and the Douglases, is really a particular pleasure, even a privilege. I want to start my talk a bit indirectly by paying tribute to a recent resident of Easton, whom I think at least a few of you might have had an acquaintance with, named Emma J. Gooby. Anybody here remember Ms. Gooby? I see Harriet does. I thought perhaps there might be a few more people. Back in 1997, Ms. Gooby did something comparable to what you and I will be attempting to do tonight. In a prose composition that's housed in this library's General Albert Hunter collection, she attempted to make a connection between her time and her life and that of her 19th century ancestors living in the days of slavery, civil war, and emancipation. She was the granddaughter of one of the 18 post-Civil War founders of nearby Unionville, an ex-slave named Joseph Gooby, who she believed had been sold into the Union Army by his master, a woman from the Miles River district named Louisa Tillman. But I want you to hear her remarkable manner of address and her poetic language that she uses in addressing her ancestor. She writes, "My spirit is communicating with yours as she attempts to figure out the meaning of what she calls your second bondage, namely his sale into the Union Army." Or listen to her reaction on first seeing what she calls his drab headstone in St. Stephen's Cemetery. "It hurts me to the core. Who were you?" What follows in her composition, all of this is in her mind, is a kind of telepathic person-to-person conversation in which she attempts to bridge the generational gap between her grandfather and herself. I want to make a few observations about this very moving composition. Several that I think are applicable to what we're about to do tonight. One is that her imagined recreation of her grandfather's experience in passing directly from the Tillman farm into the ranks of the Union Army, this was something that would have happened in one day, from slavery into the Union Army, exactly parallels the experiences of Frederick Douglass's cousin, Stephen Bailey, and Stephen's oldest son, George Washington Bailey. Joseph Gooby served in the 7th USCT, United States Colored Troops. George Bailey in the 9th, and Stephen Bailey in the 19th. All Maryland regiments comprised chiefly of Maryland slaves, or on the day that they were sold, ex-slaves, recruited by the remarkable General William Birney. Anybody here know the name William Birney?
I'm his great-great-great-grandson.
Well, I honor you because your great-great-great-grandfather was a truly remarkable man, and perhaps we'll have a chance to talk afterwards. All of them experienced what Ms. Gooby calls the proving ground of black manhood, of going from enslavement to a kind of, and this is my term, halfway freedom in the Union Army. The other observation I want to make that relates to the poetic license is to the poetic license of her writing. She's a remarkable writer. She reaches back across generations to address her ancestors spirit to spirit as though through some mode of private ancestral communication. To put it simply, she talks back to the past, hoping that the past will talk forward to her, and perhaps in doing so, tell her something essential about the meaning of her own life and times. This is what creative artists do, whether poets or novelists or filmmakers or composers. They find imaginative ways to connect the past and the present. Our mission tonight is both similar and different. We too are going to reach backward to tell the story of the past as it was here in Talbot County. But by contrast with Ms. Gooby, we can't let our imaginations roam free. We're bound by the facts, methods, and ethics of nonfiction. That's the bad news. We're constrained. But there's good news too. By digging deep into surviving records, by applying information gathered about the more general conditions of enslavement, and by listening carefully to the voices of the present generation, like that of Ms. Gooby, we can reconstruct the past to a perhaps surprisingly great degree. At least I hope by the end of this talk you'll agree with that claim. So let's do it. Our subject is the history of one of the great families of Talbot County, the Baileys, best known to the general public as the family that produced Frederick Augustus Washington Douglass, or more generally known, Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey, or more generally known, Frederick Douglass. But here in Talbot County, we may well be more immediately interested in the Bailey family, whose history as a family may be taken as representative of African American families more generally all across Talbot County, the Eastern Shore, Maryland, and even the United States. There are, I think, two ways to go about making this kind of presentation about the history of the Bailey family. One, this is my academic manner, would be to give a kind of 30 to 40 minute narrative survey, ideally concise, consecutive, coherent, of the 19th century Baileys, but that would be more suitable for publication than for a community event like this. The other is to present, and I changed the title of this a little bit, I added the phrase scenes from, would be to present scenes of the family backed up each one by an image that we can work in interpreting together, and in that way turn this into a little bit more of a workshop kind of a presentation than a formal lecture. If you want a formal lecture, you're going to get a formal exam at the end, and I don't think anybody, you don't want to take it and I don't want to grade it, right? So we're to proposition number 2. So the question is where to start. We're zooming in on District 4, that's the northeastern quadrant of the county. Here's Tuckahoe Creek on east, Caroline further east, and just north of Mrs. Rolfe's property. Can you read that all the way to the back? This is very good. It's really a good system. Right north of Mrs. Rolfe is the Queen Anne County line, and the next farm above that was the second farm owned by the Anthony family. What I'd like to suggest is that in starting with a map, we're not just looking for particular locations, we're going to read now the very logic by which the map was organized. And this is a most interesting map. There's a particular social as well as geographical logic associated with it. You know, perhaps we ought to I ought to open this up right now. Did anybody pick up the logic of how the map maker organized this map? Yeah, say it again, Leo. By property owners. I mean, this is not an automatic decision. It's a decision that privileges the notion of ownership of land. And let's remember one thing about America in the mid-19th century. The most important source of wealth was land. And what we're looking at are property owners, and you can read with me. This is the most important one right here, J.P. Anthony. We're going to talk about the Anthonys for the rest of the evening. That is the farm on which Frederick Douglass was born. That's the farm on which virtually all the Baileys going back to the beginning of the 19th century were born. Right along, if you know Douglass's narrative, all along Tuckahoe Creek, there's the bend of the creek. But there's a logic that goes beyond that. What we're looking at are white property owners. And if you're expecting me to be talking about the Baileys, you might ask, well, where in the world are the Baileys? And that's exactly what we're going to have to get to. But to get to the Baileys, we need to go through the white property structure and the white records kept by white record keepers. So bear with me, we're going to get there, but what you're looking at is the logic of white property ownership. What you're looking at is the logic of white supremacy. There's another thing that we can learn from the map. If you work with records very, very closely, you can start to form social networks. And in fact, let me just do this very quickly with you. Here's J.P. Anthony. Next door is a farmer named P.G. Stevens, Perry Stevens. Stevens has almost exactly the same kind of operation as the Anthonys did. A single man working the land with about 10 enslaved people. And you're going to see that the two of them link up through history if we have enough time. Right below that is a name that's probably familiar, Covey, right? Same family. I don't know the exact lineage, but J.P. Anthony knew not only T. Covey, he knew Edward Covey. Virtually all the names that one reads about in Douglass's first two memoirs were very well known to J.P. Anthony. Let me just go a little bit further. Here is the Kogel farm. I think I do see descendants of the Kogel family. Everybody see D. Kogel? That's Daniel Kogel. The Kogels were located primarily in the 1st district of Talbot County. They were the leading abolitionist family in the county. Quakers, great opponents of slavery, and in fact the brother of Daniel Kogel, John Kogel, was one of the military leaders to come out of Talbot County. He was a captain. He came back to Talbot County after the war and was involved in organizing the black militia. I'm talking now about after the end of the Civil War, when the rebels came back, when black veterans came back to Talbot County. It was a time of great agitation. The brother of Daniel Kogel was involved in organizing the black militia, involved in self-defense. This would have been between 1865 and 1870. The relationship between a slave owner like Anthony and Kogel, who was not a slave owner, who was opposed to it, Well, they're direct neighbors, and one interesting thing is, the year after this map was made, Anthony bought this piece of Kogel's property and added it to his farm. So when you start with social networks, if you look at maps, figure out who lives where, dig a little bit into the records, stories, affiliations begin to develop. Let me show you one more before we move on. This name is of interest to me, J.H. Rhodes, another neighboring farmer. In 1860, on January the 1st, the oldest of the Bailey daughters living on the Anthony farm was indentured for a year, was hired out to the Rhodes family. That was Mary Bailey. She was probably rented out to them the next year. In 1863, Mary Bailey was about 18 at the time, married. In 1864, in February, she had the last Bailey born into slavery, enslaved by John P. Anthony, and that child, Jeremiah, would have been the last person born into slavery and held by the Anthony family, would also have been the youngest member of the Bailey family to have been liberated and gone on with the rest of her life. Her life, by the way, can be reconstructed. So here's our social network. Just by going to the map, you can start to begin to understand the way that people built their relationships. And as I'm trying to suggest, there is a kind of a black world that lies beneath all of these names. Most of these folks were slave owners. They couldn't have managed their farms before the Civil War, or at least they thought they couldn't manage them without enslaved labor. Now you're looking at District 1. This is the Mile Rivers District. And one thing you may notice is a lot of this land is owned by the family of the Lloyds. Let me see if I can pick out some more names for you. So Lloyd here. This was where the very large majority of African American slaves were concentrated. District 1, the northeastern portion of the state, the Lloyds, of course, the families of the Unionville founders came primarily from this area, including the Goobies. The Tillmans own quite a lot of the property. But I'll show you one other group that I find very interesting. Oh, there, I just missed the Kogel. I see Mike Richards, a descendant of the Kogel family here. And Mike, you might have noticed, you probably know better than I do where to look. But on this family were the Martins. Anybody see them? Here they are, okay. 1, 2, and 3. 2 of the Bailey women were rented out in the 1840s. This is typical. A year rental would run from January 1st until Christmas. They were rented by members of the Martin family. So I know that the Anthonys and the Martins were very close. In fact, the relationship is even closer than that. So working with maps is one of the single best ways to start to locate where your people are, where they came from, whom they knew, and maybe even the relationships that they had with their neighbors. Yeah, sorry, this is not a computer I'm familiar with. Okay, now, let's get into the history of the Anthonys so we can get into the history of the Baileys. In a way, the key date in terms of the history of the Baileys, of the last generation in slavery, is this particular day. It's marked in the journal of that J.P. Anthony. This was the day that he turned 21, and you can see this is his best calligraphy. He's a farmer. It's not so good, but he's making an effort. Logbook, January 22nd, 1851, Wednesday. How many times have we heard this from our kids? 21 years old today. What that meant was that John P. Anthony on that day became a vested owner of real estate, and with the real estate, he came into ownership of the Bailey family. He is the grandson of Aaron Anthony. How many of you know the name Aaron Anthony? Right, Aaron Anthony was the original owner, the patriarch of the Anthonys, who through marriage came into ownership of the family of Frederick Douglass, back to the generation of Douglass's grandmother, Betsy Bailey. 2 generations down the line, the family line continues, and something very important happened on this particular day, or let's say within a week of this day, and that is that all the Baileys who had not been inherited through the old family, all of them were brought back together. They had been scattered for years into different kinds of homes and different kinds of places within Talbot County. On this particular day, when Anthony takes ownership over his farm, which had been rented out, as his people had been rented out, on this day, the Bailey family is reunited, and the name of the farm? Home Hill Farm. This is the beginning of the last chapter of enslavement of the Baileys in Talbot County. This chapter will go on, come on, you guys should know your Maryland history, until when? 1864. So for 13 years, we're going to have this remarkable period in which the Baileys, who had been brought together 2 generations earlier by Aaron Anthony, are now coming back together on Home Hill Farm, right where they started. And they're going to remain for the most part on Home Hill Farm until the abolition of slavery. It is an amazing story, but in fact, it's the story of many African American families. It's just that in this instance, we really can put a lot of the pieces together. And one thing that may be remarkable is, it has very little to do directly with Frederick Douglass. Douglass, of course, since 1838, had escaped and begun his life anew in the North. He was one of the very few Baileys who was able to do that. So let's go one slide further, and now you start to see how the pieces come together. Let me just magnify. What you're looking at is the 1852 tax assessment for Talbot County. I want to show you on the same page, remember I showed you earlier that Perry G. Stevens Farm is the next farm. It's adjacent to the Anthony Farm, even on the tax assessment. Obviously, the assessors were going farm to farm. And Stevens was Anthony's best friend, from what I can tell. You can see that the configuration of his farm is very similar to that of the Anthonys, Chapel District number 4, and now to the Anthonys. And you can see a few things that come into sight pretty quickly. First of all, for the tax assessors, family is of no interest whatsoever. They've broken this family apart. and divided them by gender. And not just by gender, but by value. Those who were most valuable, Stephen and Perry, are categorized at the bottom of that list, and among the females, those who were most valuable, Maria, Caroline, and Kitty, are classified at the bottom. What makes them most valuable? Two things: childbearing ability and physical capacity to do labor. And we're going to talk primarily about the second because it's absolutely crucial to an understanding of the way slavery worked. Maria is married to Perry. Caroline is married to Stephen. Kitty is harder to figure out, but I think I now am confident that she was married to a free black man by the name of Perry Wilson. Perry Wilson must have lived either nearby in either the Caroline or the Talbot County side of the line. But this was a family that clearly had a kind of structural integrity and many children. I mentioned George Washington Bailey going into the Army. Here's George at the age of 11. So we already can start to see a narrative beginning to emerge out of the archive. Now I want to take you back to the beginning of the story, 2 generations. No. What you're looking at. Oh, by the way, the person who was doing the assessment for Talbot County in 1852 was Thomas Auld. Thomas Auld was legally the owner of Frederick Douglass until 5 years before. Just to give you a sense, Anthony and Auld knew each other very well. Anthony, as a child, at times, because his father had died, was technically an orphan, was living either with the Auld family or with the Sears family, 2 families related by marriage, both in St. Michael's. Here you see the assessment that was done after Anthony's father, Andrew, died in 1833 or 1834. The county did an assessment of the property. It's the fullest assessment of what the farm looked like that Frederick Douglass and his siblings were born on. And you can see that the assessment continued. That's the real estate, and the personal estate is primarily made up of the enslaved portion of the family. Negro Betty is the great matriarch of the Bailey family. That's Betsy Bailey. Here's Perry, Stephen, Kitty, Ariana. Ariana is another sister. The birth order goes Frederick, Kitty, then Ariana. Stephen is a first cousin. Perry, I should say, the birth order goes Perry. Perry's the oldest brother. So you start to see the core of what we now call the Douglass family, but it's actually the core of the Bailey family. This is going back about 15 years before we were looking at the 1851 record. Now let's go back to the beginning with the patriarch on the other side. And this may be the most famous slave inventory in the history of Talbot County. I'm sure some of you recognize it. This is Aaron Anthony's handwriting. Negroes, ages as follows, and we have 3 different generations from Sarah, Henry, and then the one that most of us have studied most closely, Betts, which is to say Betsy Bailey, and then going down through the generations, we have the mothers, Noah and Jenny, first cousins. Noah and Jenny were the first Baileys to escape from slavery. They escaped in 1825. It's got to be one of the most amazing of the stories within the family. They escaped together and they left behind 2 children, very young children. Why they ran, nobody knows, but within a week, the Anthony family had sold those children down south into the Cotton Belt. This is the beginning of the disintegration of slavery in Maryland and the disintegration of the Bailey family as the Anthonys begin to deconstruct what had been a family that had been held stable and coherent for over a century. Douglas, by the way, would have known of these 2 cousins. He would have known them very well. And I suspect it would have had an influence on his view of slavery. But to continue, if you can see this well, I'm going to decrease the size a little bit. The inventory is famous for this one reason. Frederick Augustus, son of Harriet, 1818. This is the definitive proof of Douglas's birth. It's the entry that we've all been keyed on for about 150 years. But the point that I'd like to make is that, in fact, what to me is most integral, it's not the birth of one particular individual, it's the composite. What we're looking at is 3 generations of a family, and every member of that family has a story that needs telling. And many of them have stories, by the way, that can be told. If we dig deeply enough, we push hard enough, these stories begin to generate. I'm going to tell you a few of them besides, the terrible story of Ginny and Noah. By the way, we don't know the end of the story. We don't know what happened to them. They were never captured, and we don't know what happened, of course, to their children. We do know the story of Frederick Augustus, but to go up a little bit higher, here we have Harry again, Phil. Hang on, we're going to look a little bit at Phil's life. Another of the most interesting members of the family, Prissy, would be owned by Thomas Auld in 1836. Thomas Auld would sell Prissy and Prissy's 2-year-old daughter. We don't know why, but another moment in which the family gets separated. One other thing I'd like to point out. This was compiled by Aaron Anthony, but if you look carefully, let me show you the top of the list, you can see that the list itself has something of life of its own. If you look at the entry for Betsy, look all the way to the right. Can you make that out? Somebody was updating Aaron Anthony's list, and we know that it was updated at least until 1849. That's the year that Betsy died. And the writing is not clear. It may look like a 6 to you, but that's 1849. Since Aaron Anthony had been dead for 23 years, and all 3 of his children had been dead for at least a decade, what we know is that this inventory is part of a ledger that was kept within the Anthony family. By the way, it was kept within the Anthony family until 1961, when it was given by the 5th generation of the family to the Maryland State Archives. That somebody within the family had a continuing interest, not just in her own history, in white folks' history, but in black folks' history. This might have been, of course, because of Douglas's unusual importance But there are two candidates for who might have updated that list. One would be J.P. Anthony himself. That to me is unlikely. I think it was probably done by his daughter, Harriet Lucretia Anthony. There are a few folks here from Oxford who probably know the name. She was known as Miss Lou. She was a well-known educator in Oxford, I think up until about the 1920s. And one point that I'm making is that when you're working with original documents like this, you want to read them very carefully, not just for what they say, but for how they say it, how they signify. This is not just a dead sheet of paper. This is a living document that meant something important to the white owners that they kept referring to, apparently over a period of 2 to 3 generations. Okay, I don't think this hasn't come out very clearly. Well, in any case, let me back up a little bit. All those names that we saw in the Bailey inventory, these are our people. These are the names that we want to work with. And it's their history that we're reconstructing, going back to Aaron Anthony. We want to know what happened to these folks in the generations as we're going forward. Our story lies between Aaron Anthony in the beginning of the 19th century and J.P. Anthony. I'm going to take us up to about 1860, but what we really want to do is to know what happens at that crucial moment when slavery ends and emancipation begins. I don't think I'm going to get to that in my talk tonight, but if you want to ask about that in question and answers, I'll be happy to get to that. Now, I want to make a little shift and start to put some of these pieces together, and you're going to have to listen really carefully now, because what I'm saying is not intuitive. What we're talking about now is the connection between genealogy, lineage, history, and family. And the way that I want to connect them, this may be a little bit unusual, is by thinking about the Old Testament. I mean, you might say, what does the Bible have to do with this kind of modern slavery? And the answer is, if you think about it hard enough, there are lines of connection. And here is one that I'd like to pursue with you. To simplify it, all you need to do is to think about one particular word, a verb from the Bible, and crunch it. The word is beget, right? If you read the King James Bible, there's a lot of begetting going on in ancient times. Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, and oy, did Jacob begat so many sons, right? If you think about that, though, what you have is a chain of being, a lineage pattern that, in its fullest extent, is the history of the people. And if you think of that people strictly in terms of family, after all, like the Baileys, those people of the Bible are one family that move from generation to generation, that have a common thread that connects them. That's the logic of the Jewish Bible. Now, let me take you to the word beget in its Hebrew origin. And this doesn't translate, because Hebrew and Western languages have a totally different logic. And I can't do this on one foot, as we say in the Jewish tradition, but to make it as simple as I possibly can. In Hebrew, every word has a root of 3 consonants, 3 letters, that in a combination that can be manipulated in different combinations, the same 3 letters, in order to make a number of cognate meanings. And The term for beget in Hebrew produces the following list of words: boy, girl, birth. Every version, noun, verb, adjective related to all of those kinds of relationships. And my favorite one in this particular linguistic combination, I'll give it to you in Hebrew, is the word moledet. And moledet, that term for beget in its largest configuration, means one's homeland, one's native land. So the logic of the Bible is this, that through the process of the generations and of regeneration, one gets the story of an entire people that even connects to the notion in the abstract or in the physical of one's homeland. Now, let's translate from the Hebraic Bible into the history of African American families in the period of enslavement. To do that, we need to make one quick substitute. The Bible, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the pattern, patriarchal. When we talk about African American slavery, patriarchal will not take us very far. We need to make a substitution to the matriarchal. The line that we're following is Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and their daughters. That is, the logic of American chattel slavery was matriarchal, that one's lineage followed the status of one's mother, whose status followed that of her mother. And in fact, one of the things that I've learned in my half year on the eastern shore of Maryland, spending a lot of time in the archives, is that if you go looking for the names of mothers and infants, you've got the core of the lineage of any particular family. And those are the names that are going to be recorded most frequently. This is a very bad image, but what I would have showed you, I can tell you what it says. Among other things, when John P. Anthony was an orphan, his father had died when he was young, his guardian had to come into Talbot County Orphans Court every year, file a report, and among other things, that report would state what each and every enslaved member of the family did and how much income that person produced each year. And in this particular, I just pulled a page out, there are two members of the family, two of the women who were held, that's putting it the wrong way, who were in confinement at particular places, particular houses, farmhouses, or St. Michael's or Easton, it didn't matter, during the period in which they were about to give birth. Every time a woman gave birth, in the Anthony household, as it were, the guardian report would comment on it, would say who it was. Unfortunately, generally does not give the name of the baby, but if you're lucky, if you look hard enough, that baby's name may surface. And in that fashion, you can pretty much gather the information you need for the lineage of most members of the Bailey family. This is unusual in one regard only, that is that the young master of the family for 17 years was technically an orphan, and therefore his guardians were filing these reports every year. Let me show you two of the life stories, and to me this is part of the most rewarding aspect of doing this kind of work with the Bailey family. Remember Phil? Sounds like a bad joke. You might say to the Anthony family, remember Phil? He's the one who escaped in 1839. Phil was Frederick Douglass's first cousin, very close in the birth order. Whether they had a relationship, we can only speculate. They probably did. One thing that's interesting about Phil as a runaway, you're looking at the Easton Gazette 1839, what Phil did almost exactly replicates what Frederick had done a year earlier. And I don't mean just that he ran away and successfully ran away. Unfortunately for us, Phil disappears from history. We have no idea what happened to him, but for the same reason, neither did the Anthonys. These runaway advertisements are very, very interesting. I want to read to you just the bottom half because it tells a life story, and this is probably all we're ever going to know about this particular man. This Negro was hired to me for the present year by Mr. White Barwick, guardian to John P. Anthony of Caroline County. It is supposed that Phil was persuaded off by a free Negro woman named, I don't recognize this name, does anybody? S-I-N-A? Sina, it might be a misprint for Tina or Nina, I don't know. The wife of a Negro named Warner of this county, she having been apparently intimate with him for some time past and being now absent from her home. A reward of $100, that's a very large reward. This was, in Anthony terms, a very valuable slave. A reward of $100 will be paid by Mr. Barwick if taken out of the state, or $50 if taken in the state and secured in Denton or Easton jail. The subscriber was Thomas O. Martin. Remember the Martins, those 3 Martin farms? It's the same family. And what we know, Thomas Martin became the guardian of John P. Anthony after his stepfather, White Barwick, who had married Anthony's mother. But something went wrong in the relationship, and for reasons I don't know, Thomas O. Martin becomes the, in effect, the stepfather to Anthony. Again, you start to see how the patterns of ownership, of affiliation, of relationship come together. But the story is almost exactly the story of Frederick Douglass. Young man, enslaved, meets young woman, free, fall in love. One runs, the other follows. I would bet that this man's wife never came back to Talbot County, and the rest, as they say, is history. Douglass's history we know. Phil's and this young woman, that's another story for another day if anybody can figure that out. Here's another life story. No. I don't think you're going to be able to read this, so let me just narrate it very quickly. This is the story of Douglass's younger sister, Ariana. This is the Guardian report for Talbot County in 1849. That, by the way, is the year that Douglass's beautiful daughter, his beloved daughter, Annie, was born free and, as far as we know, very happy in Rochester, New York. The story for Ariana is very different. We get a report this year in the Guardian account of the death of Ariana in childbirth. This is a story that, as far as I know, has never been told before. Here's the language. You might think of this as this poor woman's epitaph from the Guardian report. Quote, money paid to John Mason for making coffin for servant Ariana, belonging to orphan, that's John P. Anthony, in 1848 as per account and receipt April 14, 1849. And that's it. One of the most tragic of the cohort of children descended from Harriet Bailey, that's the mother of Frederick Douglass. Ariana led an abbreviated life and left a legacy of infant mortality, none of her 4 or more pregnancies yielded a child known to have survived its mother. The identity of the father or fathers is blank. We simply don't know. So, examples, happier and less happy, of one sort or another in the family of the Baileys. If we work hard enough, I would venture to guess that we can tell the stories of quite a few more. In my book project, I'm working primarily on the lineage, on the limbs of the family tree besides Douglas, of Perry and Maria. We have a descendant of them here in the room today, and of Stephen and Caroline. Stephen and Caroline's stories can be told with remarkable fullness, and they were really a remarkable family. I'm running quite late, so let me just close by showing you one more slide to push further toward to the final moment, as it were, in the history of slavery in the Bailey family. What I did was I went into Ancestry.com, just a wonderful place for doing genealogical research, and especially the kind, well, all kinds, but for those of us who want to reconstruct families, African American families, ethnic families, immigrant families, this is an absolutely invaluable resource. What you're looking at is what's called the slave schedule for 1860. This is the end of the road, folks, right? This is the moment at which slavery is about to die. But ironically, for the Anthony family, they're holding more people in slavery in 1860 than they had since grandfather Aaron had assembled an even larger number of people, mostly from the Bailey family. Unfortunately, Ancestry doesn't give names, but if you know enough, if you have the right statistics, you can begin to match male 49, that's Perry Bailey. Male 47, that's Stephen Bailey. Male 20 in 1860, that was Stephen Bailey. I'm sorry, that was George Bailey. And male number 19, that's Thomas Downs, or Thomas Bailey Downs. And so on, all the way down the list. I guess my final point is that all of those people, 23 people, held in slavery in 1860, on November the 1st, 1864, were free and had a new life ahead of them. I'll just tell you one last fact about the Anthony family. 6 months after the end of slavery, the Anthonys bought a second farm in the Oxford area of the county, and 6 months after that, they sold Home Hill Farm. Why would they have sold their ancestral farm? Simple answer, because without slaves, they could not manage. And that really is the moment at which the families separate. Whether there were continuing relations between the Baileys on one side of the county, and then most of the Baileys then moved over Tuckahoe into Caroline County, and the Anthonys who remained mostly in the area of Oxford. Well, that's a subject that's worth further investigation. Thank you for your attention.